Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.
Hello, and welcome to Champions of Psychology, a show with the goal of openly talking about mental health and gaming presented by Codename Entertainment and TakeThis.org. Every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on twitch.tv/CNE Games or later on your favorite podcast service, Mitra, Jordan, and Raffael Boccamazzo, aka Dr. B, talk about mental health in these unprecedented times as well as how gaming affects us. If you're with us live in the chat, you can leave a question that I, your community manager, Treavor Bettis, will ask them later in the show. Our topic today is resilience, but before we get to that, Mitra, Dr. B, who are you for the fine folks who may not know?
So I'm a therapist working in Victoria, British Columbia. I absolutely love games. I often end up working with clients with games and issues around screens, screen times, games, tabletop games even. And I'm having a lot of trouble keeping this earpiece in my ear. So if you notice me going like this a lot, please don't worry about it. Just as you were.
As you do.
As you do. As you will.
Yeah. And I am Raffael Boccamazzo, better known as the Dr. B, or just Dr. B for long Italian name reasons. And I am a doctor of clinical psychology and non-practicing doctor of clinical psychology. Do nothing but policy and education these days as the clinical director over at TakeThis.org, which was at the time the first mental health nonprofit to serve the game community. I am also an autism self-advocate, as well as an expert on the applied use of role-playing games and just games in general in clinical and learning settings. And I'm happy to be here with you all to discuss resilience.
Resilience.
Yes. And I know, viewers, it's the audio got desynced again. I thought I'd fixed it. I guess I hadn't. So here we are. We'll figure it out. I literally have closed every program but the ones that are keeping the show going. So I don't know what it is. But resilience. We're going to be resilient and just keep going. Where do we want to start with resilience?
Well, it helps to define things. Who wants to define resilience? Oh, you over there.
I think I just got voluntold.
Yes.
I can do it. I can.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I see. We're keen on me doing it then. Okay. So resilience is that quality of being able to roll with the punches, really, more than anything else, to be able to cope with things. And sometimes we have a breaking point. In fact, each of us has a breaking point, and resilience can come and go in our lives depending on the circumstances surrounding it. But it's essentially that ability to go, I can tolerate this. I can manage this, while at the same time not ignoring your feelings. And that's an important one, because we can run roughshod over ourselves, but that's not actually going to help. I'm just going to do this now. So
wait a minute. Hold on, Mitra. You're telling us that resilience isn't the same thing as denial?
Definitely not.
I don't believe you.
You're in denial, which ain't no river in anywhere.
Yeah, it's, you know what? I mean, there's so many, and I'm going to stumble over my own words just horribly. We talked about this a lot yesterday in our pre-production meeting, and there are so many fantastic game metaphors for the concept of resilience, and just bringing in an real easy one, Constitution and wisdom saves.
Absolutely.
That's basically what we're talking about here. The ability to get through both physically and mentally demanding tasks or things that just tax your ability to cope. And Mitra makes an incredibly powerful distinction in that part of getting through things is acknowledging that a problem exists in the first place. Denial in and of itself, basically sticking your fingers in your ears and going, la, 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 this isn't happening, can actually make things worse.
But I really like doing that. It feels nice.
I'm going to be actually doing this quite a bit, so I don't really know where that fits with our conversation.
I mean, as long as listen. So Mitra, you are acknowledging that your earbuds are not fitting properly, and you're working with the problem to address it.
Yes, mainly by jamming them in there really hard.
Champions of Psychology does not endorse sticking things in your ears.
That's a good disclaimer to have.
Really?
Well, one of the things that Mitra brought up that I really think we need to talk about is the idea that everybody has a breaking point. Like we as a society fetishize this idea of mental and physical strength, as if not being resilient in a situation is some sort of moral failure. And those who get through situations are somehow more virtuous than the rest of us. Cool, great, yes. However, we all have a breaking point. And that is not a moral failure. There's a concept in psychology called the diathesis stress model. And it's a way of addressing this whole nature versus nurture idea. And the answer is kind of is it nature versus nurture? And the answer is yes. And it's this idea that we're born with certain genetic predispositions, certain vulnerabilities. And some of us are born with more vulnerabilities than others. Think of it like water in a water glass being filled up to a certain degree. And what makes it overflow is the environment. And it doesn't matter who we are. The environment can put enough into our glasses to make anybody's overflow.
Absolutely. I think that this is such an important point that you're making, because people have an idea of being, a workhorse or something, that we can plow through, we're tough, we're sturdy. And resilience is about sturdiness in some ways, absolutely. But we're not going to be sturdy over everything. And the piece that's also important is to bring in the context in which we're operating our lives, so that I may be doing fine. I might be really super resilient, but then, along comes a pandemic and I can't see any of my friends, and I can't use any of the resources that I used to use, and I can't go work out at the gym. What you don't realize until it happens is that those things are what you may not realize. Some of us know, of course, how important these things are in terms of our mental health, these activities. But for some people, it's like, yeah, that's what I do. And now I suddenly can't do my life, and I'm going to be less resilient. I have less tools in my tool belt. And you all been here for a while know about our self-help tool belt and what we talk about in terms of creating supports in our life. And that's what resilience is about. It's the outcome of the supports that we're able to create, and the outcome of our experiences of getting through things that were tough. And there are some things that really interfere with that.
Well, and another misconception that Mitra, I don't know if you run into this with the clients you work with, but something that back in the days when I did work with clients, a really common misconception that we often worked with was the idea that because somebody is struggling with something, it meant they weren't somehow getting through it. As if on some level, a lot of people seem to equate resilience with things are easy. And those are, sometimes things just suck. And just because things suck and you're struggling doesn't mean you're not getting through it. Because sometimes, I mean, if we're going back to game metaphors, sometimes boss battles are hard. Boss battles are meant to be hard.
Exactly.
But it doesn't mean you get it, but you can still get through it, and it can still be hard. And I think we need to challenge ourselves as a whole that we need to start incorporating this idea that, first of all, resilience is not denial. Resilience is not avoidance. Resilience is not us metaphorically going, la, 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 this isn't happening, this isn't happening. But resilience also doesn't mean that things are easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, unfortunately, the way our media presents how heroes deal with challenges can be unfortunate in that you get sort of a montage, you know, of them kind of coping with something or working out hard or, you know, kind of going through a difficult phase, right? And then it's over. You know, then they emerge stronger. But life isn't about a montage. Life is about kind of coping day after day. And there's something about how we sit with other people's pain that makes it anxious making much of the time for people to cope with the fact that someone else is in pain, and they want to remove that distress. They want to remove the cause of the pain. And you can't, you know, a piece of it is to be present and supportive during someone's struggle, but to recognize that it is their struggle. And while you can make parts of it easier, you can't hurry it along. And that goes for the struggle you see other people encountering. And of course, it goes for your own. And to some degree, it even goes for the struggle of your kids. You can protect up to a point, you can support, you can, but, you know, if they're having a falling out with their best friend and that makes the next few days or weeks of school really tough, that's life. That's part of their journey. So resilience is what we build up when we go through difficult times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, in my mind, it harkens back to something Treavor brought up.
I did.
Dark Souls.
I know that one.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. What is it you said about the lessons that Dark Souls taught you?
Oh, geez. I mean, the basically not giving up. Like it tells you from the get. Literally, the back of the first game's box said, "Prepare to die," because that is what you are going to do a lot. And so, yeah, beating your head against the wall that is that boss fight is like, if someone told me, oh yeah, you know, like I got all the way up to the Abyss Watchers, then I couldn't beat them and I stopped playing, I'd be like, I get that. That is a difficult as hell boss fight. And if you weren't having fun, don't play it. It's as easy as that. Like that is a not a struggle you have to force yourself through. But that was one, like, I remember I think it took me about 8 times going up against them, and I finally did it, and I literally jumped off my couch cheering because I did it.
Well, and I know Mitra is going to really jump on board with this, but one of the beefs I have with this fetishized notion of, you know, mental strength through all things is this individualistic concept that we all have to do this on our own. And that's a very, in many respects, that's a very Western culturally anchored idea. There are concepts in psychology that talk about, maybe some of you have heard of what's called the locus of control.
Talk about on the show.
Yeah.
But I don't remember if we talked about the locus of responsibility.
No, have not heard that one.
Okay.
That's fresh in my ears.
Well, I'm gonna bring up a name that I know Mitra loves, Donald Wing Su.
Absolutely.
And Wing Su talked about this idea in cultural perspectives of the locus of responsibility. So this locus of control and locus of responsibility, and it talks about basically the systems that are in play around us. And to bring this into a gaming metaphor, like if you go into a campaign setting in like Dungeons and Dragons or any tabletop role-playing game where the environment itself, like let's say you go into like a psychic realm where everything's constantly shifting around you, and every 5 minutes you have to roll a wisdom save. How long are you gonna make it in there? Like you could, in certain circumstances, you might be the most strong character you could think of, but there's only so much you can do when the environment and the systems are breaking you down. And that's not something that we see addressed in a lot of these myths, these montages, these presentations of our heroes, especially in North American culture. We just see, the individual who's, succeeding against all odds. Well, what are those all odds? There's a lot that gets in the way of our ability to thrive just on a systemic level. And we often don't take those into account when we start feeling guilty about our ability to not do certain things.
Absolutely. I think it is the challenge, and we were, I think, talking about this yesterday, is that when individuals have been in a context for a while, it's like the survival has kind of kicked in to cope with it. And there's a part of you that might forget or set aside how challenging your context has been. So, I've had people come in to my office and say, I've been struggling with a divorce, and I've had to move, and I'm in the middle of a legal battle, with my ex, and, my mother's getting really sick. And then after that, that's what we've set, that's kind of the stage, if you will. And then they say, but I'm finding it really difficult to get ahead at work. Or, these courses that I was doing, I'm finding it really difficult to get through. And I'm thinking, of course you are.
Yeah.
Have you met your life?
Have you met your life? I like that a lot.
Well, and Roland HTG brings something up in chat that this is something I actually address in a lot of the workshops I give to a lot of game studios and so forth, that the systems in place contribute in many respects more to the wellness of the people involved than the individual can, because you can only do so much with the adventuring gear you're given. Okay.
Exactly.
And, if you live in a system that is constantly beating you down, of course, you're not going to be able to get ahead with the same ease that somebody else who doesn't have those same systemic obstacles. Right. And yet we fetishize this individual achievement. And we feel guilty when we're somehow not achieving it.
We routinely mention people who have had tremendous success, financial or otherwise, and we forget about the fact that maybe they went to Harvard, or maybe their parents, had a lot of money, and maybe their parents fronted their first company or something, Mm-hmm. They did not. The term self-made kind of misses out who else helped make you, or what advantages you came in with. But
right.
I can tell you that a lot of times, if you're a cis white dude, you're probably doing the video game on the easy setting compared to what it's been like for many people in the world.
When I was a kid, this is such a little kid thought, anytime I'd hear someone say I'm a self-made man or like something like that, I literally would picture them like, no, they started at a farm, because that's how all jobs start, I guess. like it was like they got dirty with it, and then they slowly built it up bigger and bigger, and it was that's how I always pictured it as a child.
and I'm going to be very clear that when I say that, I certainly don't mean every person in the world who is not a person of color. Let's be really clear. I am saying, though, that I think in society that is unequal and more patriarchal and is not so kind to all minorities, we can see some real variation in people's capacity to achieve their goals, particularly if there's been financial support for them and if there's been educational support for them. You know, it does make things easier. And so for people who didn't have that and have kind of really had to struggle, please recognize that when you see other people having it easier, it is entirely possible that they do. And this doesn't take away from that personal responsibility piece as well, or from your capacity to achieve in the future. Mm-hmm. But you do need to take a look, not just at your own capacity, at this idea of being able to get through, but the circumstances that you're dealing with. You know, if they include a bereavement or a loss or, you know, some challenge, it's development, as in how we progress in the world isn't like a linear thing. Mm-hmm. It gets interrupted all along the way by these challenges we encounter.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, if I want you all to, in the chat, in the audience, to take away one thing, it's this idea that resilience is not entirely about you. The campaign setting in which you play has a big influence on how you are able to cope with environmental stressors. And Mitra brings up a lot of really good points here. Like, for any of us who ever played the Oregon Trail growing up, it's a lot easier to play as a banker who starts with 2,000 than it is to play as a carpenter who starts with 400.
Yeah.
You know, you can get more supplies, you can build up a better network, you can have better equipment. You know, for Terry Pratchett fans out there, the Vimes theory of boot economics is another good example. Look that up if you're not familiar. It's brilliant.
Love Inspector Vimes.
I don't know why this popped into my head when you were talking about this, but it made me think of the old Daniel Tosh joke that money can't buy happiness is bull, because try frowning on a wave runner. So I will say this, that when I was married to a woman who had a pretty darn successful job. And I did not come from a family with a lot of money. I had to put myself through school and all of the student loans and everything that entails. And suddenly I was in a marriage where my wife made, frankly, more money than I ever dreamed about. And to her, it was just normal. To me, I'm just like, I'm sorry, what? And having been there temporarily and now not having that again, I will say money makes a difference.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Money makes a big difference.
Yeah. Money may not be able to buy happiness, but what it does is it eases the other challenges you experience. In other words, it raises your other stats.
Yep.
And you have more time. You're not in survival mode to the same degree, I hope. You know, of course, some people who are in an unhappy situation with their spouses, some things are made easier, but if you don't have the wonderful connection, that's going to lower your stats again. Mm-hmm. So
when I didn't have to worry about health insurance on a regular basis, when I didn't have to worry about dental care, when the idea that this was actually my measure of success in life, that if the car were to break down and we needed to replace it, it was an inconvenience instead of a crisis. And that mindset was a huge difference. That the idea that routine medical bills weren't an emergency.
Yeah.
That maybe the money didn't buy the happiness directly, but the fact that I was no longer in like survival mode all the time, and could build upon that foundation, that made a huge difference. And so systems are a huge part of resilience.
Yeah. You put in, so we met yesterday, listeners and viewers, and talked about this stuff. And over the night, Dr. B found some more stuff in a paper that he wrote. What you have a section here about trauma.
Excellent paper.
What is going on there?
Trauma.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
he's keen on talking about it, I can tell.
Trauma. Well, I mean, if we want to get into it, there was the one time the boot had teeth, and then it was coming for me, and that was a weird nightmare. But I don't know. But
all right. Shall I dive in there?
Yeah, no, go for it. I will admit it's because it's a book chapter I wrote. I'm really self-conscious about it.
You're fine.
So you were talking about managing post-traumatic stress, and you used the example of several games. And I admit I read it late at night. And so I'm just going to talk about...
You had the boot dream too?
Luckily, no. I had no dreams. I fell into a deep and dreamless sleep, one which did not involve having to stick things too hard into my ears either. But let's stay on track here. So trauma interferes with our capacity to get past survival and into thrival. And overcoming or moving through trauma let's look at this. So if you've got trauma on one hand and you've got the resilience you're trying to bring to the situation on the other, sometimes they kind of seesaw like this, right? Some days you might have a little more capacity to thrive and to move forward. And sometimes that resilience is taken up with just helping you survive. It's like being in a boss fight and you've got your healer, and sometimes the healer has enough mana to really kind of keep you healed as you cope with this. And sometimes the mana drains and you're exhausted and you're more at risk. And that's kind of how resilience works with trauma, in that your traumatic experience that you're kind of struggling with or managing, the symptoms of which might be anxiety, sleeplessness, difficulty focusing, just to mention a couple of them, that's going to affect how much resilience you're able to put towards other aspects of your life.
Yeah. One of the things that I wrote in that chapter is, first of all, fear responses are functional.
Absolutely.
Fear keeps us alive when there's a legitimate danger out there, because that we also have this fetishized idea that, you know, heroes don't feel fear. That is complete bull.
Yeah, it's the opposite. You're proceeding in spite or with your fear. You and your fear are walking hand in hand towards whatever it is you're trying to conquer. It's not like your fear goes anywhere. The more experience you have dealing with something, and we call it exposure therapy, but the more experience you have coping with something, the more resilience you build up to cope with that particular situation, which can have a really good overflow effect on other things. As in, I coped with this one thing over here, pretty sure I can manage this other situation. We can bring our strengths with us.
And so we've been talking a lot about like systemic obstacles to a sense of resilience, but one of the things I wrote about pretty heavily in this book chapter are especially when it comes to potential trauma events, because one of the I want to be clear about something. We have all been exposed, statistically speaking, pretty much all of us have been exposed to what could be considered a traumatic event. That's something that has the potential to cause trauma. If we want to narrowly define it the way the DSM does, it's either firsthand or secondhand exposure to grievous bodily harm, threatened or actual death, or sexual violence. And pretty much all of us have been exposed to stuff like that one way or the other. But I go into really heavily in this book chapter on what are the things that the individual and systemic factors that can lead to some people developing post-trauma symptoms versus those who kind of just move with it.
So I'm going to mention something that was traumatic for me that we could look at as almost trauma with a small t, because as a practicing therapist, we often talk about trauma with a small t. This does not mean it doesn't affect your daily experience, okay? It does not mean it didn't have an impact. So when I was 5, living in Pakistan, Pakistan was at war with India. And I lived through something called the Indo-Pakistan War. I was living in Karachi, and Karachi was bombed. Karachi was being bombed. And
wow.
the thing we did was we blacked out our, well, first of all, we covered our windows with newspaper and we blacked them out with black paint. And this was because if there was a chink of light, your house could be bombed. So you wanted to make sure nothing was seen. Okay, so blacked out the windows, heavy curtains over them, you know, going out only at certain times during the day. There were rations on sugar and so on, you know, milk, whatever, all the things. And we, at night, we had kerosene lamps or candles that we only used in certain parts of the house. And I remember my aunt playing a game with one of her cousins, a board game, under the stairs with a kerosene lamp in the middle of the house, nowhere near any of the windows, even though they were blacked out. So for many years, my husband didn't understand why at night I was always very carefully drawing the curtains. And I'm going to tell you right now, I forgot that I had lived through this. I mean, I hadn't forgotten that it happened. And if you'd said, hey, have you lived through a war? I would have said, yeah. And I remember the air raid sirens. I would have said that. I did remember. What I did not remember was the effect it had on my daily life with this curtain business. And, you know, if somebody carelessly drew a curtain and didn't completely cover the window, I'd have to fix it. And I'm not the world's most tidy person. I'm going to tell you right now. But in this way, I was like immaculate. You see the curtains behind me? My curtains had to look like that all the time at night, once it was dark. So it took me years, but then I realized, wait a second. That's where this comes from. So when we talk about trauma, we're talking sometimes also about, well, obviously we're talking about serious trauma and how it impacts your resilience in ways that you might not recognize. But I want to also bring in this piece around how trauma, things that you don't quite remember, also sap your energy, create anxiety. If you have ever had a near drowning experience, maybe you did learn to swim, but maybe there's always a piece of you that's anxious being in boats. I don't know, but it's something worth considering because it may be having an impact on your experience. And it can therefore impact your resilience.
And, you know, you're getting more into something that is a relatively new-ish term within mental health, and that's called post-traumatic growth. And it's this what well, it's this idea that over the course of the history of psychology and psychiatry, much of the default has been getting people back to sort of baseline functioning. And in the last 40-ish years, there's been more and more questions being brought up of, okay, well, if we get people back to baseline, what if we can get them beyond that into a thriving state? And this idea of post-traumatic growth kind of asks the question, how can we take a trauma event, and a trauma event we'll broadly define as an inescapable event that is stressful enough to completely overwhelm our ability to cope. If we take that trauma and we not only get back to baseline, but we use it in a way to create change to get us past baseline to help us thrive. That's this idea of post-traumatic growth. And I'm hesitant to get into all of the factors that can go into it, just looking at the time.
Yeah, we got to take a break here in a moment, but we got a little bit more to talk about this one. I feel like we could almost do more than a half a topic's worth for that one. But yeah, let's go ahead and take our break to remind our viewers and listeners of our disclaimer, and we will be right back.
Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.
Okay. Sorry, I interrupted you on that one.
Well, I kind of interrupted me.
Hey, you give me the segue to it. So is there any more that you want to do about the trauma aspect of this, or?
Yeah, I mean, we want to, when we think about things, this is largely defined around trauma events, but there's overlap in some of these things in terms of resilience within the rest of our lives. And there's this idea of resilience factors before a trauma event called pre-event factors. There's resilience factors around the time of the event itself called peri-event factors. And then there's the stuff afterwards called post-event factors. And some of this stuff is really not going to be shocking to people. Like this idea that certain pre-event factors that can contribute to people's either resilience or vulnerability to stressful events, things like childhood stability. I mean, Mitra and I talked about that. And the idea that if you have a more stable foundation on which to build, it's easier to get back to where you want to be if the house gets knocked down, in this metaphor. But incidentally, also a realistic, flexible belief in one's ability to cope and a flexible, realistic sense of optimism. It's not this sort of, again, it's not a denial of facts. It's this idea that I've handled things in the past. I can handle things in the present. It's a question of how, and it's a question of how awful is this going to be? Not that this is going to be a piece of cake, but you know what? I've gotten through stuff in the past and I can get through stuff again. And, but additionally, a predisposition towards anxiety for some of us, and I'm one of them, who have a more anxious disposition to begin with. We tend to be a little bit more vulnerable to things overwhelming us. Things around the time of the event, the peri-event factors. Well, I mean, the event itself. You know, if the more significantly distressing an event is, the more extreme an event is, the more it's likely going to have a long-lasting impact on you. Right. Mitra brought up a great example.
Yeah. And then in terms of post-event support, it helps if people believe you. It's actually huge. How much support you get after the event is a really big piece of it. Oh, yeah. Do you get to talk about it? Did other people experience it with you? And are they present, or did they go into survival mode? And did you therefore not really get to discuss the effect? Right. In terms of one thing that seems unrelated, so forgive me, but a lot of people who've had to deal with multiple migration, particularly as children, talk about the loss of home. And I'm not just talking about refugees. I'm even talking about people whose maybe a parent or two parents were in the military and there was a lot of travel and therefore some chaos. I mean, there might be some certainty because bases look the same, or if your parents were diplomats, the houses can look nice. But the fact is you had to leave a community and find your way in another. Some of these kids deal a lot with loss and grief over place, and it's traumatic for them because at certain ages we're just not in a place to move. We really need the stability around us to thrive. So this can be experienced as traumatic, and in some cases there wasn't a lot of family support It was like, well, on to the next thing. What an adventure, you know, and there may not have been a lot of room to kind of process the loss. So when we talk about the pre and during and post experience of trauma, such a big piece of managing and thriving through it is how it gets processed. Mm-hmm. Sure, what we came into, how armored were we for that particular boss fight? You know, what experience did we have with an event? But the afterwards is actually a huge piece. You know, there's a lot of research to show that when people deal with assault in one form or another, the support around how lovingly, how carefully, how caringly they are treated afterwards makes a massive difference.
Connectedness and community really are, and this, so there, I mean, there's different research that exists for, you know, different factors, and some of it is, you know, inconclusive, but we've said this before, and we're going to say this again: connectedness and community are really two things that are consistently positive markers for our ability to cope with stress in a way that is functional. And that's really what we're talking about when it comes to resilience. And both before, both after, both during, do we feel alone? Do we feel helpless? Do we feel, like Mitra said, we can be heard, that we can process our experiences in our own way, in our own time? And it's, yeah, basically your adventuring party, that is one of the greatest pillars to your own resilience. Do you have help from the outside? This is why I will just rally against this idea of the self-made hero, the individual, because nobody succeeds on their own.
No. And it's also why it's so important to talk about mental health issues. Because the more we can reduce the stigma and have open and caring and supported conversations about mental health, the easier it is to stay resilient through our mental health challenges. I might have to let a cat out.
It's okay.
The bell has been lovely.
Never mind.
Sorry, I've been quiet this one because this is one that I definitely kind of wanted to just listen more of. I don't have as much to put in on it. But the last thing we've got here on there is the things that strengthen our resilience. And what do you want to say about that one?
I think several things really do. We've already addressed the idea of community, which I think is a really big one. Validation, that's another really big one. Events that we can recall coming through and resources we were able to kind of use. So if, for instance, you're going through a challenging time, I'm going to use the example of, say, you're coming out in some way or another, and you're able to tap into a community of people who've had that experience, and you're able to tap into their wisdom and support of what that was like. I can think back to a time when I was a new mom, and I was lucky enough to have a community of moms around me. And that was really helpful because it's a pretty scary time. You're pretty sure you're going to mess up real bad, and you don't feel quite ready for this. But to have the support of other people who are going through the same thing, as well as the support of very experienced parents who can offer how they coped with challenges, right? And maybe occasionally therapy as well, because that's how we build up what's going to be resilience for us. Because resilience is specific to each of us. There's some general rules, but then there's the things that we just love that help us. You know, if there's any time for a hobby or to get together with a friend and do a fun thing together, these are things that add to our resilience because they fill our cup. They make it easier to cope with the challenges we experience.
One thing that's very big in coping with challenges, regardless of whether they raise to the level of capital T trauma or not, is the ability to derive meaning from them. And for a lot of people, moving not past, because there's no cure for memories. Okay, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind was a weird movie for a reason. Okay. Memories stay with us, and moving with those memories and creating positive meaning out of them is an important step for a lot of folks in building their own sense of resilience. I mean, I'll say there's a reason I do what I do. My childhood was quirky. And I want to take a lot of those experiences and use them to help others, to derive meaning from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ability to look at one's life narrative, both as a retrospective and in the future, and create the kind of meaning that we want, that can be an important step for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about, it just kind of came to me because these moments do. I'm thinking about that moment in Good Will Hunting where the Robin Williams character says to the Matt Damon character, "It's not your fault."
Mm.
Because the Matt Damon character had experienced a lot of abuse at the hands of his father, who was quite physically violent with him.
Right.
And the problem with that is we kind of take in this idea as a child that we deserve it, right? If we weren't loved properly, it must mean we're unlovable.
Mm.
And so to be told over and over again, it's not your fault. Because the thing is, we often do take responsibility for a context over which we have no control.
Right.
And particularly as a child, we have no control. And if someone attacks or hurts or harms us, we have no control, yet we blame ourselves. We have an assumption of control in these situations that simply isn't true. So for a very serious moment, I want to say, look, if anybody has hurt you, that's on them. And there is a piece of us that tends to shut down at those times because we go into fight, flight, or freeze. We have less capacity in those times because a part of our body, an evolutionary part, comes in to support us so that we don't die.
Mm-hmm.
And it determines what's going to happen next. We don't have access to the rest of our brain. This is a different side of our brain. So when we feel like we should have fought back, we should have done this, we should have done that. No, in that moment, we did what we could do and we did what we knew.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really just important to take in.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's a huge piece of how we gain resilience afterwards.
Well, and to build off of that a little bit, thinking about that "it's not your fault" scene, because it's a very powerful scene. And I will say I experienced this I have a pretty extensive capital T trauma history that I don't give specifics about publicly. But when that's pressed against, because people do create narratives around how they are and how the world is. And if that narrative is pressed against too quickly, we tend to fight back because we've spent, in many of our cases, decades functioning in the world a certain way. And so Mitra likes to bring up the idea of the zone of proximal development, this idea that in order for us to change, there's a sweet spot. And that's why this is part of the reason that, again, back when I used to work with people, we use the metaphor of leveling up slowly. You don't come in as a level 1 wizard and fight a Tarrasque. Like ever.
You
Unless
have
it's
to
a
take
comedy.
on what you can. Yeah, you have to take on what you can and trust your capacity
Right.
instead of pushing yourself beyond it, because it's how you build resilience.
Right.
If you were to go work out, you wouldn't start with the hardest weight machines.
My shoulder says otherwise. I got to make an appointment.
Let's check in with chat and see what they have been up to during this conversation. Reavero1 says, is there any difference between short-term resilience, dealing with a specific situation or stress, and long-term resilience, pandemic, major life-changing events, etc.?
I mean, understanding if you're in the midst of a marathon, not a sprint, makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
So just figuring out what sorts of challenge you're up against can help you also create your party in order to move through that challenge better.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say there is, though, because a short-term challenge might not be as and will not be as exhausting for your system.
Yeah.
Because you'll have time to, you come in hopefully in a healthy state, and then you move through whatever it is. And then hopefully you can move into a recovery state sooner than something that's a year or two. That's a grind. That's different. You have to continue to try to recover. You cannot push through a situation like a pandemic, as I think we've all learned. So.
Yeah, it's with short-term situations, there are a lot more opportunities just to be like, listen, I'll ignore it, it'll go away, and I'm just going to do my own thing. And there's a subtle line there between suppression and repression, but that's a different debate for a different time. But you can't do that with long-term stressors. Long-term stressors have to get dealt with one way or the other. And I can't just distract myself through long-term stressors, because then that becomes a form of avoidance, and then things get worse.
I'm going to also bring in the idea that a short-term extreme stress can still lead to a long-term challenge in terms of processing something. For example, if there's an accident and then a subsequent death. So the initial crisis we can kind of cope with, and then even the decisions around funerals and all the rest of it. But then afterwards, our system has still been really profoundly shocked, especially if we didn't see an event coming. It's not like if a loved one was ill for some time and we kind of get our heads around it, we get to say goodbye. That's very different, of course. And so, yeah, there's a whole process of coping with that. And in the months and years following, there's a continued healing process.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that brings us back to this idea of how extreme the event is. I mean, the level of distress, again, the level 1 wizard level, fighting a Tarrasque. Yeah. Sorry, squishy wizard friend.
I can hide all the dice rolls I want behind that screen. Still not going to go well for you.
Nope.
Nope.
That's going to be like Godzilla versus Bambi.
Oh God, yes.
So our mod Martin grabbed this one because it would they thought it'd be a good topic conversation, which I agree. Tiny Pencil said trauma can make you funnier though, and I relate to that. There is, so for people who don't
Definitely.
know, I'm donor conceived, which means I don't have a dad. And I used to make a joke all the time because people would be like, do you ever want to meet your donor? And I'm like, there was a joke that a stand-up comedian did a long time ago that I kind of co-opted. And I was just like, no, because I'm afraid I'm going to go up to him and be like, you're my dad. And he's going to be like, you're beer money. And it's a funny joke, but it was true. And I didn't really realize, because I just thought it was a funny joke. I didn't realize how true that was though, until like I actually got to read the donor sheet. And he put on there, why are you doing this? And he said, because it seems mutually beneficial to both parties and I'm happy to help. And I just started crying. And I was like, oh, okay, that was a real thing that I was laughing about. All right, cool.
Yeah. Although the idea that you have to suffer to be creative is a bit of a myth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do actually have to let a cat out. Okay. 1 second.
But I will say a lot of my best jokes come out of pathos. I will say that a lot of the people around me have said, have said my best jokes come from angry Dr. B.
Yeah, that is true. I angry Treavor does somehow still stay funny. Yes, the chat is now lighting up with kitty and cat.
Oh God, I'm sorry, chat. I know how we all get. I know.
But no, I definitely do understand where that was coming from with it. Because yeah, I've definitely made jokes and stuff about trauma and stuff like that. And one hand, it's a good funny joke. On the other hand, just lets me bypass those feelings real fast.
Yeah.
What's up, deflection?
Yeah.
Hey.
And sometimes that's super useful, right? Because if you say to someone, yeah, my mom died, when I was 13 or whatever, and they go into, oh, I'm so sorry mode. And you're like, you know what? I don't want to feel like that kid right now.
Well,
right. So I'm just going to make a dead mom joke or something. Exactly.
Yeah.
And no one wants to, well, sometimes that's okay and appropriate, but a lot of the time, no. if a thing happened to you, you don't want to manage other people's feelings around it. So
Yeah.
Oh, I want a lifting cat Olympics. That's working for me. Curiosity. Thank you so much. I feel like I'm about right. Like that's a good trap move. You know, that's like.
Yeah, no, we're going to get into the Maine Coon cat division and just.
V Muse held up her Maine Coon cat during a marketing meeting yesterday, and it was the long cat.
I'd rather have long cats than long COVID, that's for sure. Sorry.
Wow.
Now things are just coming out of
Speaking of dark humor.
Wow. Well, I don't know a better way to wrap up the conversation on that one.
Oh, man.
That's where we're at. Bow ties coming undone.
It is.
So, yeah, chat, there was a lot of great questions and observations in here. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but thank you again for putting them in there so we can grab them and possibly talk about them. Mitra, Dr. B, where can people find you if they would like to do so on the interwebs?
So I'm at Mitra Jordan. That's my Twitter handle. I have a website, mitrajordan.com. You're welcome to reach out to either. And Dr. B is everywhere.
I'm now on Twitch.
He is.
I'm hosting 4 times a week study sessions.
Ooh.
And you got affiliate through it.
I made affiliate in a week and a half doing that.
Oh man, look, studying actually is good for something. Who knew?
It's body doubling study sessions where I'm just on camera studying quietly and other people are joining in. People are, because of my baritone voice, people are calling it Dr. BSMR.
Oh God.
But you can find all of my socials at the Dr. B. That's TheeDoctorB as in boy.
See, I want to do a co-stream now where it's you quietly studying and it's me quietly building Gundam. So occasionally there's just a snip from the
that's basically what we're doing. It's just other people are working on their projects. I'm doing my stuff. I'm working on flashcards and people are writing, people are folding laundry, whatever. It's ridiculous. Even after I'm done with this, I'm probably going to still do it just to paint minis.
Oh my God. I think it's absolutely great. When I was having to get through my master's, it was always really helpful to be in a room with someone else because otherwise my ADHD, man.
Oh yeah.
Well, that's why I'm doing it because of my autism.
We should get a cup of tea. We should get this. We should do that. Ooh, I forgot to call my aunt. Like, you know?
Right.
That was literally 3 seconds in the mind of an ADHD person.
I know.
It took you 3 seconds.
I'm just gonna get that. Look at this.
You can find me on the Difficulty Class podcast every Friday, as well as Champions of Lore every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on twitch.tv/CNE Games, as well as on Twitter at the Treavor. There's an 8 hiding in there. Thank you, Martin, for moderating in the chat today, and thank you to Codename Entertainment and Take This for giving us an opportunity to have these discussions. If you missed any part of this show, you can listen to it later as a podcast. Yes, there is a podcast. I say it every episode, but please go listen to the podcast. It's a really good podcast. I'm going to say podcast again. Go listen to the podcast. It posted to
listen to the podcast.
It's a podcast.
If you have any suggestions for future topics, you can send them to championsofpsychology@codenameentertainment.com. Let's see if you're live with us right now. We've got Bardic Inspiration at 1 p.m. Dylan and Jason Charles Miller are going to be doing songs about gods, godly music and whatnot. And you can help them choose which deity they're going to do. But that is going to do it for this week's episode. So until next week, take care of yourself.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.